Okay, so last time we had finished the Seven Years' War and some of the aftermath of that war, especially the Proclamation Line of 1763. But now we need to talk about um, British policy after that, after the war. Of course, uh, it cost the British a lot of money to fight the war. They were in debt. Plus, it also took money to defend the American colonies, to station troops here. So they had this staggering debt. And the British tried to find ways to pay off this debt at home. One was a cider tax that was so unpopular that it drove people out of office. So the British decided, well, why shouldn't the Americans pay for some of the cost? Not a whole lot of the cost, but some of the cost of their own defense. And so the Prime Minister, Lord Grenville, came up with a new plan called the Stamp Act. And this was passed in February of 1765, where it said that, and would go into effect in November, it would put a tax on all printed matter. That could be legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, posters, almanacs, bonds, leases, deeds, licenses, insurance policy, college diploma, dice, because they have printed dots on them, playing cards, to everyone. And no one thought that this would be a big issue. If you'd ask the average member of parliament or the average man on average person on the street in London, what do you think about the Stamp Act? They would have no clue about what you were talking about. Well, when the news of the Stamp Act hits America, that creates outrages. There are pamphlets or speeches. There's resolutions against it. And this is when you start getting it, hear that phrase, no taxation without representation. And they say, look, we're being taxed, but we have no representation in the British Parliament. Well, Britain responded by saying, well, you have virtual representation. Well, that sounds weird, the way we're doing things today. They said that many Englishmen had no representation. They didn't have an elected official there. But they argue that every member of parliament represented the empire as a whole. So even though you might be from London, you also represented Charleston, South Carolina, Manchester, England, all those places. They said, so their answer was that every member of parliament represents everybody, and some places in England didn't have representation. Well, everybody in the colonies was very upset about the Stamp Act. And so we start getting a group of militants, I guess you would call them, called the Sons of Liberty. They would be the insurgents of the day. They would meet under liberty trees. And what they were going to do was they were going to intimidate anybody that was hired by the British government to collect the tax, the stamp tax. For example, in Boston, under Liberty Tree, they had they took a dummy and hung a dummy, and it said Andrew Oliver on it. That's the stamp agent. Well, that tells Andrew Oliver that maybe I don't need to be doing this job. I'll resign immediately. And then trying to find people to take the job was very difficult. So by the time the Stamp Act went into effect, it was effectively dead because there was no one to collect the tax. And the colonists began adopting what they call non-importation agreements, where they would not buy English imports. So they would make their own clothes, what they would call homespun. Instead of tea, they would drink sage or sassafras tea. And this was designed to hit the British in their pocketbooks. Massachusetts asks for a meeting of all the colonies, which become known as the Stamp Act Congress, in which 9 colonies show up with about 27 delegates. And they send a declaration of rights and grievances to the king asking for relief, a repeal of the Stamp Act. Well, it does work. There's a new prime minister in town. He sympathizes with the British, and they repeal the Stamp Act. But on the same day they repealed the Stamp Act, the Parliament also passes the Declaratory Act, which says that, yeah, we took away your Stamp Act, but we have the power to make laws binding on all the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So it didn't say anything about taxes, but it's trying to tell them we have a right to tax you if we want to. And so we follow up with what they call the Townshend Acts. What the Townshend Act does, it puts a tax on all colonial imports of glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, primarily one of the things they had done. And so again, what happens is the Americans will decide to boycott, to begin what they call non-importation. They start doing homespun again. They start developing some of their own manufacturing. And of course, colonial press will put out a lot of news about this. One of the essays by John Dickinson, a Philadelphia lawyer, was trying to resolve the dispute by persuading people. And so in late 1767, he writes 12 what he called letters of a Pennsylvania farmer, which he sort of thought of himself as being. They began appearing in Pennsylvania newspapers. He said that the colonists held that Parliament had the right to regulate commerce. That was fine, and collect taxes incidental to that purpose, but it was not right to levy taxes just for revenue. And so Dickinson tried to use a moderate tone, but he also says, look, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sit back and do nothing. There has to be concerted action. Well, that brings us to Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty. Sam Adams is probably one of the people that gets the American Revolution going more than anybody. Now, Adams had graduated from Harvard. He had inherited a family brewery, which he quickly ran into bankruptcy. He really wasn't that interested in money. He really sort of interested in politics. He didn't have a lot of, time for ceremony or display. He spent most of his time at local taverns, arguing political issues with common folks, sailors and people like that. He often wore a dingy red coat and an ink-stained shirt. He'd bring this huge Newfoundland dog to the tavern. He'd eat raw oysters and fish chowder, and then complained about British rule. So while other people are attending their private affairs, Sam Adams is whipping up the Sons of Liberty, organizing protests in Boston, having town meetings. Early in 1768, he and James Otis, another famous early patriot, sent down a circular letter to all the colonies saying that restating the illegality of parliamentary taxation. Something about Sam Adams. Sam Adams is one of the people that really gets the American Revolution started, but you really don't hear much about him because you probably think Sam Adams and you think beer, right? But the reason you don't hear as much about Sam Adams is that he did have somewhat of a mouth on him and he dressed rather dingy. And so what happened is when they started writing the history of the American Revolution, they wanted people to idolize it. You could have your kids look up to George Washington, Ben Franklin. They thought Sam Adams was a bit of too much of a rabble rouser. Well, the British respond to all this commotion by sending troops to the colonies, and particularly in Boston. They see Boston as sort of the hotbed of revolution. And so there's a lot of British soldiers in Boston. Ben Franklin, who was in London at the time, urged the British not to do this. He said it was like lighting a match in a room full of gunpowder. This will end in disaster. And it tended to, because the Bostonians, who already felt oppressed, now feel even more oppressed with these soldiers here. They call them lobsterbacks. They insult them. They spit on them. And then on March 5th, 1777, in the square before the Customs House, which, by the way, that Customs House still exists. You can go there and stand on the spot where this is going to happen. There was a couple of guards in front of the Customs House when a group of people started taunting them and throwing snowballs at these two centuries. They call for help, and that brought in reinforcements. Well, these reinforcements, they have their guns, they're ready to go, but they're not going to fire. They're not bloodthirsty killers. But they start getting these snowballs being thrown at them with oysters in them, and then they get hit with sticks. And eventually one of them is hit with a stick and falls down, and his gun goes off. Well, as you can imagine, when one gun goes off, then everybody's gun starts firing. Before their captain is able to say, stop firing, quit firing. But by then, 5 people are dead. One of the first being Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave who'd worked for some years out of ships out of Boston. Now, you can look in your book. It probably has a picture of the Boston Massacre as driven by Sam Adams. In his case, it's showing that these are innocent citizens, and the British were just being brutes, which was not true. In fact, the soldiers are going to be indicted for murder, and they need a lawyer. And the person they find as lawyer is John Adams, the future president, who is Sam Adams' cousin. John Adams wants to prove that these soldiers can get a fair trial in America, which he does. All of the soldiers are acquitted because he says he blames it on the mob, except for 2 who are convicted of manslaughter, and they're branded on their thumb. Another event that happens almost the same time is a British schooner called the Gaspee, which was patrolling for smugglers, accidentally ran aground. A crowd from the town nearby, near Providence, Rhode Island, set fire to the vessel, and they could not find anybody to blame. So things are getting tense. And finally, the British come up with a new idea. They want to bail out the British East India Company. It's in some financial distraught. So what they thought they would do is that they would sell this excess tea that the British East India Company had to the colonies at a reduced price. There'd be a small tax on it, but they would still be paying less for their tea. And so the British said, well, they really can't complain about that, paying less for something, even though there's a tax on it. But when they pass the Tea Acts to do this, the Americans still don't buy it. When the tea is brought over, in New York and in Philadelphia, the tea is turned around and sent back. In Charleston, South Carolina, it was unloaded into warehouses, but later sold to finance the revolution. But in Boston, it's going to be a test of will between the colonial Governor Hutchinson, and Sam Adams and his Sons of Liberty. It's a test of will. The ship's captains keep saying, look, we probably should turn back. But Hutchinson said, no, we're going to make sure that this tea is unloaded and the tax paid, probably because he had 2 sons who stood to profit from that tea. Well, on December 16th, late at night, a group of men somewhat dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded the 3 ships carrying the tea. It's a very quiet act. And they take 342 chests of tea and throw it overboard. There's not a lot of yelling or screaming. It's mainly just ploop, ploop, ploop into the water it goes. One person is caught putting some of the tea in their pockets to take them home. They strip that person naked and make him run home in the snow naked. They break a lock. Somebody goes out and buys a new one to replace that lock. But it's a huge act. It's a statement of defiance that everybody knows. And so Parliament says, man, they're pushing it into our face. We're going to discipline Boston. And so they'll pass a series of acts known as the coercive acts, or in America known as the intolerable acts. One they'll close the port of Boston until the lost tea is paid for. They said, no more will we be trying redcoats in America. We'll take them back over to England because we don't trust you. Americans to give them a fair trial. There's a new Quartering Act, which said that local authorities had to provide housing for soldiers in private homes as necessary, hence the Third Amendment to the Constitution. And then finally, the Massachusetts Government Act made the colony's council and law enforcement officers all appointed rather than elected. So there goes self-government. Thomas Hutchinson is replaced by General Thomas Gage as the new governor. And now Massachusetts is under military rule. These actions were all designed to isolate Boston and make them an example to the other colonies. Instead, your Virginia, your South Carolina, you go, if they can do that to Massachusetts, they can do it to all of us. We need to rally around Massachusetts. There were people in Parliament that oppose this too. Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservatism, said that your scheme yields no revenue. It yields nothing but discontent, disorder, disobedience. He said that really, why are we trying to tax them so much? We make so much money off of trade. So the other colonies rally up to the cause. They send provisions to Boston. In Williamsburg, Virginia, the assembly meets, the Virginia Assembly meets, and they want to have a day of fasting and prayer for Boston. The governor says, no, you cannot meet. I'm dissolving you. Get out of the Capitol. So they go to a nearby tavern and draw up a resolution for a Continental Congress to meet to talk about what the colonies can do in this situation. So we'll stop there. And for the next time, we'll talk about the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence and the war.